right, Mike. So let's get started today by learning a little bit about your professional background. What sort of journey did you take that's brought you into supply chain?
Yeah, and Kelly, I'm glad to be here this morning, and I thank you for taking the time. My journey to supply chain is not a linear conversation in any way, shape, or form. I am what I would describe as the accidental retailer. I didn't intend to be a retailer, but I ended up in it and fell in love with it. And that happened, the better part of about 28, 29 years ago. I was in consulting. One thing led to another. I was in different industries. And then I had a chance to tap into retail with a boutique firm here in the Bay Area. And it was about building that first generation e-commerce engine. And that lit the fire for me in terms of, how do you build this channel? How do you think about this channel? How do you operate this channel differently? And throughout the course of the next, 25, 26 years, I've been focused on the demand side, right? How do I drive people to, take the things that they need and turn them into wants, and the things that they want and turn them into needs. And so I never really thought about the fulfillment and the supply chain side, because it was just like, that's the easy part of the conversation. Fast forward 25 years, I walk out of operating roles and we'll walk out of, having to, manage a P&L. And I got onto this side of the equation, and I was like, there's something different here. There's something that needs to be thought about differently, because just keeping, just not thinking about how we generate demand, but and then ask the fulfillment folks to figure out how to deliver everything that we've convinced our customers to buy is a chaotic moment, right? Everything goes into this, and it's up to the guys in the warehouse and the guys in the fulfillment organizations, and it's the folks on the carrier side to somehow satisfy that customer in that last piece. And so, about 4 or 5 years ago, a friend of mine asked me, he said, I've got an idea for a company that we can take that chaotic moment and create some orchestration out of it. And that's what that was the premise for the eighth notch, which was, how do we take that moment in everybody's neighborhood where there are delivery trucks driving around 5 to 7 days a week constantly, and see if we can create some orchestration on that, where there are less of those trucks on the road, but everybody's still getting everything that they had originally ordered.
Now, I think this is really interesting. And one of the things that is going to unfold during this conversation is, regardless of whether listeners and viewers are in retail, operations, what role they hold in the supply chain, I would be willing to wager that everyone listening in has experienced what we're going to talk about from a consumer standpoint. You talked a little bit about all of the delivery trucks being in neighborhoods and on city streets. But you've learned a lot in the work that you've done since 2019. Can you talk about it a little bit from the consumer perspective, both what you've learned and around how this chaotic moment, as you talk about it, is something that people are experiencing every day today?
Yeah, and it was and it was something that was clearly exacerbated and turbocharged, and really became very, very clear to me during lockdown, right?
Yeah.
Not clearly a time that we all want to think about, but a time that we all went through in this collective experience, where we just said everything needs to be brought to us, right? We're not going to go out. We're going to have everything brought to us. And it stretched things, and it broke some things, but it also showed that there was this massive adoption, or greater adoption, that there was already occurring, where people were just saying, I'm going to go online, I'm going to order, and I'm going to have everything brought to me. And that was groceries and daily food, and as well as e-commerce purchases as well. And to me, the breaking point was a moment where I was ordering from, I ordered 5-weight t-shirts, and I figured it would be a pretty simple order, where all of us, where one day a box would show up and 5 white t-shirts would show up in it. And what actually happened was, there were 4 deliveries over 3 days with all 5 white t-shirts, because they came from different locations. Because that's what the retailer does, right? Is they fulfill from every inventory location, trying to match what they believe is the consumer's desire of speed. And they got 5 t-shirts to me as quickly as possible, but I really wanted all 5 at the same time, and I didn't want to have to go searching for them. So we talk about the conditioning of the consumer to think that everything can be brought to them, but the consumer is thinking differently about the problem because there's a convenience component to it. And the 5-way T-shirt example is one of those where I didn't want all five, showing up over different days. I wanted this basic product to show up in one shipment. And now I've got to figure out, do I make a customer service call? Is there a potential of porch piracy, right? Everything that has gone on as we've gone through this. And then to me, in addition to that, I started thinking about, there's got to be a sustainability component to this. It doesn't make sense that delivery truck made multiple stops in front of my house to bring me what is a core basic item. And is there a better way of being able to think about it? And that was the breakthrough. And, I could walk through, example after example after example in terms of how consumers are starting to shift their thought process and their behavioral component and their thinking, because they're starting to recognize that having everything brought to them needs to be done in a better way, because we're not going to change that behavior. But if we can improve that behavior, that there's an opportunity to, feel a little less guilty about our purchases being brought to us.
Well, and as a consumer, there is an element of psychology to this, right?
Totally.
Because especially when you start getting into complex analytics or optimization scenarios, typically you're baking in your assumptions right up front. And typically, I think most of us assume people would rather get things faster than slower. And it's a relatively simple statement, maybe an overgeneralization, but once that's baked in, all of the things that end up changing downstream have different forms of significant impact. And so the shipper and the carrier probably think about time a little bit differently than consumers do, depending on the purchase. What are some of the assumptions that you think shippers end up making about consumers that then have this cascading effect down through how they deliver and handle that whole customer experience?
Yeah, and we'll touch on the Amazon conditioning topic a couple of times
Yes,
as we
we
go
will.
through
Yeah.
this. Right. And I think that is the real great conditioning moment for every retailer. And I've always said this, and I'll say this publicly here. A very wise person once told me is that, Amazon isn't smarter than other retailers. They just get to the right decision faster. And whether it's through experimentation or courage or something, they chose very early on to say speed is absolutely imperative, because speed will build loyalty.
Yeah.
And so that was what they pushed for. Now we'll talk about what I believe is a second wave of conditioning coming from Amazon a little bit later. But they conditioned the rest of the retailers to say, I got to catch up. I got to figure out how to do it. And your question about the assumption in the consumer's mind, sure, fast is better, but is fast always necessary, right? And I think what it really becomes is, can I have it on the day that I really want it to have, and or can I understand the impact that I'm potentially having? I mean, there's a couple studies out there that have talked about kind of this changing wave of consumerism that's happening right now, where over 67% of people are starting to factor environmentally friendly practices into their purchase behavior, right? Whether it's the product or whether it's the fulfillment exercise, et cetera. Almost 3/4 of all customers that receive 5 or more packages start thinking that, maybe sustainable fulfillment is a little bit more important, because they're starting to understand the guilt factor. And almost 82% of people are willing to wait longer if you offer them something different, right? And so they can, we talk about absolution of guilt, right? I have the same problem, right? I'm a reformed, mass consumer. I'm trying to consume differently at this point. And if somebody offers me something that says, hey, it's going to take a little bit slower, but it's going to be greener, I'm all over that. So I think the consumers are changing, but the retailers are still caught on this first wave of the Amazon conditioning, where they're still pushing speed as the must. And we're seeing this with the retailers that we work with, which is, you have to change your way of thinking. You have to change your mindset and understand that time should be used more strategically to satisfy your customer than just saying that the early part of the order cycle is the only valuable time.
And it's hard for retailers, right? Because it's not like they can necessarily infer based on your shopping behavior. We'll stay with your five white t-shirts. Are these five white t-shirts where you just once a year say, you know what, got to freshen the wardrobe. Whenever these five white t-shirts get here, that's when I'll switch over from last year's five white t-shirts, versus someone that's getting ready to go on vacation and they
Right.
really need these five white
Right.
t-shirts at the last minute,
Right.
without literally offering consumers the overt option to say, how and when do you want to receive this product? There's almost no way for that retailer to know from an e-commerce interaction why you're buying these t-shirts, what level of urgency is associated with that. And so I think that's where we get back into this case where they're assuming, to your point about conditioning, that everybody wants it as fast as possible. And that's how to make you happy. And to the Amazon example, that's how to secure your loyalty.
Yeah, no, and your commentary around consumer intent and the assumption that is made when the explicit question is not asked and answered is absolutely true, right? Right, and so this is something that we counsel some of our retailers that we're working with, which is you have an option now to, and we can talk about the mechanics of what we do because we're in a post-checkout world, but it's really about taking advantage of the moment I get the order until the commitment that I've made to the consumer as to when it's going to get there, to use that time more strategically. And we say the back end is just as valuable as the front end. But what if you moved up into checkout and you said, hey, if you're willing to give me more time, I will find the greenest option available to you. I will work aggressively with our carrier partner to be able to find a way that you get packages that come together, either everything that you ordered that are in split shipments, or which I think is one of the secret sauces of what we offer. It's everything that you've ordered from every retailer that's coming through that carrier that could be delivered at the same time. And that's the unlock, right? That's where this, I mentioned the word orchestration,
Yep.
Conversation becomes a little bit differently, because then that's when you're talking about, instead of the driver stopping twice at my house with a box each time, he stops once with 2 boxes. And that's the change. But that's inviting the consumer into the conversation, right? In lieu of that, I think you're right. I mean, if I haven't given you my explicit preference, right,
Yeah.
around that, because either I'm swapping out or I'm going on vacation, right? I make the implicit assumption that you want it fast, right? Because that's the conditioning that the retail industry has gone through over the last 15 years.
Now, you've talked about this idea of waves of consumer conditioning. Let's sort of go back and dig into that a little bit. So, what are the 2 waves, and where would you say the average consumer is on that maturity journey?
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned 2, but I think there's 3 in here, 2.5, right? 2.7. I mean, I think that, I think the first wave was Amazon that came forward and just said free and fast is the most important thing in the world. So everybody struggled to figure out how to make that operationally work and financially engineer it, right? The second one was, then that drove a loyalty program, right? And Prime is the greatest loyalty program in the history of man, right? I can't think of one that is more impactful in my personal life and probably in all of our personal lives, right? Because it's just this underlying tone all the time, right? And so conditioning free and fast, driving a loyalty program, so you come back thinking that free and fast is always the answer. Now the third piece is, now they're saying, all right, free and fast, especially at the speed levels that we were doing, at the volume levels that we're doing, is not sustainable operationally and financially, right? And so what they've done, and I think we're all seeing it, whether we recognize it or not, every time we get to checkout with Amazon, you have a choice. And it could be the Amazon Day, which just happens to be probably the day that they've got some delivery density happening in your neighborhood or your zip code, so it works for them operationally. Or they say, hey, look, if you choose a different day, this is environmentally important, right? Because it means less boxes, less trucks, less deliveries, right? And so they're out there conditioning the consumer. And so those metrics that I mentioned about 5 minutes ago, I think are only going to increase, right? Because now they're saying, well, I mean, if Amazon does it, smartest retailer in the world, why doesn't every other retailer think in this fashion as well? And I think those that that determine a way of being able to either take advantage of this and or offer it, in that explicit conversation with the consumer, has a better chance of being able to succeed in this second wave of adoption and conditioning.
Well, and it's interesting too, because Amazon is in such a unique place where not only are they this massive retailer, but in a lot of cases, they're also their own final mile logistics provider, right? And so they have that integration. You've talked about sort of playing in the place downstream from checkout, where it's a little bit different to manage the delivery once that transaction is
Mhm.
over. But Amazon has the opportunity to consolidate that, which gives them yet another advantage. And as we go through these waves, I'm sure it's going to be something else that third party delivery companies, FedEx, UPS, the post office, all of those are going to have to figure out a way to keep pace without that integration that Amazon enjoys.
It's it's an imperative, right, that I think they recognize that they could not sustain, that they could not operationally sustain in terms of the growth that they were on, and the ability to just build more warehouses and put more trucks and add more planes, to the conversation, that they needed to figure out a way of orchestrating and using time as one of those components. You mentioned kind of the three major carriers out there. We're in business with one of them, right? And it's one of the big two, right? And this is exactly the conversation.
Yeah.
They're saying operationally, I need it in order to tune my network and to minimize the capital costs that I'm going to have to focus on in the future. But also, I've got this massive operational savings that goes on as well. And at least the way that we worked with them is that we created this gain share model that allows them to benefit, allows the retailer to benefit financially, and also we take a component of that as well. But that's the unlock, right? That's the unlock, is that if you can get the retailer saying, I need to think differently about this, and my carrier partner, because they aren't, because they don't deliver all the way through final mile, the carrier does that on their behalf, but my carrier partner is thinking about that as well. Then that is the major unlock between the two, because then it's about how do they cooperate and collaborate differently than they have in the past, which was always, I'm going to shove as much volume to you as possible. I'm not going to give you a lot of information. I'm not going to give you insights into forecasts, et cetera. And you figure it out, and I want you to lower your costs, right? Which is a race to the bottom.
Yeah. Now, we've talked about retailers thinking differently. And right now, we're in an interesting time because we actually have a couple of very unique retailers that are starting to lead to a shift in the overall supply chain as well as the customer experience. If we have sort of on the fast end, there's Amazon, where in some cases you can get it same day, right? Products are getting to people incredibly fast. But we also know that Temu and Shein have risen in popularity, and the volume of packages they're sending in. These are factory to consumer, where they're actually even bypassing customs, right? Because the packages are under that $800 value. But at the same time, people are willing to wait weeks to get those goods. And it's interesting if you think about that as almost defining an unofficial range. If Amazon is either today or in 2 days, in most cases, then you've got Temu and Shein on the other end, where it's commercially a lot less expensive to the customer, but you have to wait weeks for that product or those products to show up. And now there's talk that Amazon may be opening their own business unit to sort of mimic the Temu and Shein model, where they're also going to be on the longer end of delivery, at least to start with. How did these two ends of, the 48-hour window and then the 2 to 3 week window kind of all play together to teach us a little something about consumer expectations?
If I said I don't know, Kelly, is that okay?
That's completely valid. We will think more of you for it, Mike.
but I will. Well, yes, and I will offer an opinion. Right. I think. Yeah. I mentioned earlier that the pinnacle of my retail career was at Macy's, right? And if I ever knew anything about the American consumers, they loved the deal, right? They loved the promotion. They loved where they felt like they were getting value for less money paid, right?
Yeah.
And the rise of the Temus and the Sheins are all about that, whether it's the fast fashion or or fast mass manufacturing of something. And the Temu one fascinates me a little bit because it's a quality conversation
Yeah.
in many cases. But somebody says, I got this and it only cost me X, is such an endorphin rush for the American consumer that I think they are willing to wait. So I think that what we want to do is we want to be able to say, let's change the endorphin rush, right? Right. I got the product I really wanted. Yeah, I got it at a price that made a lot of sense, but I did it in a manner that actually wasn't as harmful to the environment as it might have been, because I was willing to use time differently. And I think that's the zeitgeist that I want to tap into, that I want to continue to tap into. And if we're seeing, even again, the smartest retailer in the world think about it, that they're obviously doing it because they're the greatest capitalists I've ever run into, right? They figure out how to make money in really interesting, smart ways. There must be a reason for doing this, right? And if they're going to compete against the Temus and the Sheins of the world, that makes perfect sense. But it sounds like they're also going to say, I'm not going to give you a commitment on time.
Yeah.
So you'll get it when you get it, right? But it's such a screaming deal to you that you'll still think that there was incredible value creation. And given the Amazon network, there is no reason why they couldn't say, I'm going to deliver that next Thursday because that's when I'm already going to that customer's house or I'm going to that customer's neighborhood. It's a smart move on their part because it breaks the speed paradigm.
Yeah, no, it absolutely does. And it's interesting because we've talked about all these different motivating factors, right? There's getting the deal, there's saving money, both on the consumer's standpoint and the retailers and the carriers' standpoint. We've talked about having less vehicles in our neighborhoods. And we've also talked about sort of the sustainability impact of less stops and less packaging and all of that. How powerful is it that all of these different motivating factors in this case can actually come together to align our interests in all of these different areas by not saying, well, maybe there's an inconvenience, but it's better for the environment, or maybe it's better for the environment, but it's going to cost you a little bit more. In this case, it does seem like all of these different motivating factors are sort of lining up to something that might be able to drive more systemic change.
I think there is, right? I mean, we could go through the sustainability on the product side, on the Temus of the world, which is a different question, right? And I'm really just focused on the delivery component, but
Sure.
I also think in my own consumerism in different ways. Like I don't normally show up at interviews in a hoodie, but this is one that's made from bamboo fiber, so it's renewable, right? So I kind of lean into that conversation a little bit. I mean, I think that there is an inflection point, right? And I think there is an inflection point, and the variables are changing, right? And I think this notion of, making a sustainable choice, whether it be from, a company's, brand image, from the product that they manufacture and they sell, all the way down to the fulfillment that they choose or that they tend to lean into. It's a perfect moment, because I think that's the way that we need to think about this as consumers. I mean, look, all the messaging that we're hearing constantly is that people are looking for more sustainable ways of operating. I don't believe it's just the way that it was 5 or 10 years ago, where it was carbon offset. This is carbon avoidance.
Yeah.
Right. This is about, how do I think differently about the problem? And that's what we're attempting to do, which is, every time I don't have a delivery truck stop in front of your house, 800 grams of CO2 is never created.
Yeah.
Right. And if I can do that at scale, now we're talking about routes being reduced, trucks off the road, maybe days of the week taken out of the network. Right. And that to me, I think, is where that's where humans are going to solve this problem differently. Right. It's all right in front of us. Right. And it's that chaotic moment that we mentioned early on. It's that how do you make sense out of that chaos? How do you orchestrate? How do you synchronize? Because it's all there if people were willing to make a simple, different choice around time.
Yeah. Now, we're going to start to talk about the data in just a minute, but one more sort of behavioral or habit-based question I want to ask you first. You talked about during the lockdowns how people across generations and demographic lines started having more and more things
Mhm.
shipped to their homes, types of product and service that they wouldn't have had delivered to them in the past. But how savvy do you think the average consumer is today in terms of managing their own final mile? And I know you and I had talked about this previously. I'm probably something of a final mile power user, partially from working in supply chain. I find it fascinating the level of control that some carriers will provide me with. I'm that person that's watching a tracking number. And if it's more convenient for me, because maybe I'm interviewing somebody and I don't want my doorbell to ring, I will reroute that item to a local pickup spot and I'll go get it. Or I will think in advance of placing an order. Okay, I know this company ships through the mail versus shipping through FedEx or UPS, and I have a different level of control. That impacts the timing of my purchase.
Mhm.
But I don't know if I'm the average consumer. To what extent are people getting actively involved in their own final mile?
Yeah, you are. I would say you're not the average yet, right? You're well above average, Kelly, right. You're in the top 20 percentile. I would think, and I put myself in that category as well, because it's game mechanics for me in many cases, right? I think people are recognized, but I think all you have to do is have one package stolen from your front porch,
Right.
and you think about the problem differently, right?
Yeah.
Or if you have something like, I had something happen yesterday. I mean, for some reason, this retailer thought it was really, really, really smart to deliver something to me on Sunday while I was out, right? And no communication. And it wasn't necessarily the retailer, it was that the carrier made a choice because they told me it's coming on Monday. So I'm ready for Monday, right?
Yeah.
And then because of something that happened in their network, that they decided to rush it to me on a Sunday because it was a priority package that they'd missed me on Friday with. So it's a really good question, but I think though we look for ways of managing our lives in all the different ways and scheduling our lives in all the different ways. Why not take full advantage of what retailers and carriers are giving you, right? And the carriers are getting better at this, right? They're not great at it, but
Decidedly.
right. I mean, but I would think you've seen an elevation at FedEx and UPS and even with the postal service, right?
Yep.
Right? Where if people lean into and sign up for these things, granted, there's a carrier or two that charges for it, which I'm not, necessarily in agreement for, but they say, that this is, once or twice a year, then the consumer is really willing to pay for it. I think it's going to become the norm, right? I don't think we're there yet, right?
Mm.
But again, I think you have a package stolen, you have it delivered on a day that is inconvenient for you, or as you were saying, you're in the middle of a podcast and the doorbell rings, right? Right? There's
Yeah.
nothing worse, right? And so I think that we as humans will find a way to do this because it is this wall of packages that's coming at us, right?
Yeah.
And making sense of that wall of packages, I think, is something that we will see consumers, you know, um, take advantage of more and more, right? I think the tools will be there. It's up to the consumers to actually take full advantage of.
Now, as we have this wall of packages, I am already thinking in the back of my mind, operationally, there is a mountain of data that goes with each wall of packages.
Yeah.
And so, if we start to think about the data and the analytical requirements that go along with solving this complex problem, how complex would you say the analytics are around trying to synchronize these shipments?
Yeah, it's surprisingly easier than I expected, and yet harder to get adoption of. Right.
Mm.
So I'll go a little bit deeper on that. The carrier partner that we have a relationship with has a forecasting system that they know everything that's in flight and is going to be delivered over the next 8 days to every delivery address that they have. That is a massive data source for us to be able to tap into, and that's what we do connections to, and also the predictive analytics off of, right? And also we're learning a lot about every address in America, every delivery address in America, in a smart data protected way, right? In terms of delivery frequency, delivery velocity, to allow us to be much more predictive around, a package that I should hold for an extra day because I might be able to find a match for it versus one that I won't because it's going to a rural delivery that gets one package every for 3 months. It's something that I think it's kind of the undiscovered country, right? It's the space that hasn't been mined and taken action on enough, and I would say that the data is available, right? And it's about creating the cooperation and collaboration. I mean,
Mm.
our goal is to even go further upstream, where the retailers and the carriers are working together to
Yeah.
say these are the packages that could come to you, right? Because the carrier doesn't see it until the scan happens, when it goes into their truck. But if they knew, right, either from a forecast standpoint or at point of sale or wherever else, these are the packages that will be coming to you, then it allows them to be able to manage the network differently and also provide different delivery options to that consumer because of this matching capability that we have.
Now, do you find that because these carriers are already running very complex delivery networks on the data, that by and large, the data quality is where it needs to be to do the analytics that you need to do?
I actually think the data quality is pretty good, right? The data quality, it's the willingness to trust the outcome, right?
Mm,
Because, and we're going to go back to it is breaking the conditioning of speed, right? Right. Our biggest challenge is with each retailer that we have is give me a little bit more of that front end time so I can take advantage of the back end time that you've made in your commitment to the consumer. And again, their problem is, but I'm, I'm measured on how quickly I ship a package out, not necessarily the quality of the delivery. It's how
right.
quickly I ship it out. Because that there are things you don't want the consumer to cancel, you don't want them to place a call, but that's also communication. So I think that data is very good. It's just what the retailer does in this adoption curve that they're on right now in terms of utilizing it to unlock the value that I've talked about, which is both financial and sustainability. That's been the real challenge. Right now, the data is pretty good. Now, if I went further upstream, that's where I think the data might be, somewhat
Okay.
compromised. But in the moment, right, knowing everything that's coming to Mike Robinson's address over the next 8 days, that's pretty good. Knowing how long it would actually take from point A to point B to get the next package to me is pretty good. And being able to inject it into the network at a specific time, and the efficacy of the network to be able to deliver it on that time commitment is pretty good. And I'd say high 80s, 90s, right,
Yeah.
right in terms of effectiveness. It's actually taking action on that decision and on that date on that scheduled date that we're giving to the retailer is where the kind of I'm not so sure, right? Maybe I will, and the ones that do it blows their minds in terms of the quality, in terms of the unlock from the financial and the sustainable savings that they can get.
Yeah. And in some ways, we're already experiencing this sort of upstream difference in challenge. I mean, I think all the time, again, supply chain geek, right? But I get an email that says that, oh, your package is shipped or whatever, and here's your tracking number. And you click on it, and the message that you get is X retailer told me it's coming. And then sometimes you wait for 3 days before they actually say, hey, now we have the package and we can start moving this in the right direction. It's interesting because you can already see who has maybe the better automation, maybe who's a little bit more on top of the process. If I were that retailer, I'd probably be thinking, don't even tell them I told you it was coming until you have it in your hands, because you could have 2 or 3 days where as a consumer, you're thinking, where in the process is my package? I have no idea.
I can bet you the retailer thinks that is a good message, right? Because they've said, I've committed to you that it's going to
Yeah.
come with this carrier. I haven't committed to you timing, right?
Yeah.
And I'm with you. And that's probably in the in small and medium sized businesses where they've effectively printed the label,
Yep.
right? Or they have a pickup that only happens 2 or 3 days a week, right? And so the package is waiting for a UPS pickup. Yeah, I find that maddening as well because I want to take control of it, right?
Right.
Right. But back to our other conversation, right? As a consumer, now I want to control it. The fact that I can't control it because it hasn't started its journey yet
Yeah.
is really the challenge. Yeah, I mean, I think that is one of the one of those disconnects that can get connected differently. But I'm guessing it's been offered to the retailer to say, here's a way to, communicate to your customer that we've made the commitment. We've got
Yeah,
it.
it's a touch
We've got it
point.
boxed. The label's been printed, right? Right. And so guess what? It's coming. Don't know when, but it's
Yeah.
coming.
Now, for larger retailers, we also know, and I'm guessing this is probably the case with your 5 white t-shirts, that maybe 2 of them came from a warehouse and maybe the other 3 came from retail locations, where retailers that have a brick and mortar footprint are using store locations as well as distribution centers to get product out to customers. How does that fulfillment model end up either working into the system that we're talking about or potentially complicating the analytics?
Yeah, it's a really good question, because I would say warehouses and distribution centers are pretty predictable. Store operations aren't, right? Right. And whether that's from I have the inventory, to I can pick it, to I can get it boxed, right? Because you're asking store associates to do a lot of things. And
Yeah.
and I think, right, wrong, or indifferent, it's the right thing, because of the, that these stores are much closer to the consumer in many cases. I think that's where it gets complicated, which is why we don't recommend, at least in our business, starting with stores, is that we move to stores over time. Much like the creation of the fulfillment network for a retailer, they started with their warehouses and their high-speed distribution centers because of the predictable nature of it, right? Then they went to stores because of the forward deployed inventory, right? We think that as the store operations get better and better, this is something we can pull in. But in that 5 white t-shirt example, 2 of those t-shirts came from stores, right? And which again blew my mind, right? It's a white t-shirt, it's a staple, that the district and the other 3 came from 3 different distribution centers, right? So it's the brokenness of the inventory too, that also, I think what we offer, and I think as people think about orchestration and synchronization of fulfillment, it kind of helps in the question of, where do I place my inventory initially, right? Which I think is always the hardest thing for a retailer to get right, especially when you're talking about, not just 7 locations with the distribution centers that are geographically defined, and you can probably get a heavy concentration of the same SKUs in each. Now I've got hundreds of stores that have, broken size and color, right? Or have exactly the size and color that the consumer is looking for. So I think it helps in that conversation. Especially as people are trying to figure out, where do you source inventory to. In a perfect world, people would have one place where inventory comes from, right?
I'm sure they would love to have that business situation. It's just not the reality that we find ourselves with.
No, it isn't.
Now, we've talked about both retailers and carriers. What types of relationships have you needed to build with both groups? Because there's a slightly different value proposition. I mean, related, absolutely. But what would you say about the message that wins them over, and the types of relationships that you've forged sort of at both tiers in the supply chain based on the changes that need to be made?
Yeah, I'll start on the carrier side, because it's where we started our journey, right?
Yeah.
We went to the 2 major package carriers in the U.S. and said, is this a problem that you're trying to solve? Both of them said yes, but one of them said, I'm willing to have the second conversation.
Okay.
And it was because something that they were already doing, and they were doing with a very, very few number of retailers, and they wanted to figure out how to go network wide. And so they had a desire to do it, because they saw it. Delivery density is the term that they coined to it, and they recognize it. And that they're on record by talking about, a movement of a few basis points creates hundreds of millions of dollars of operational savings.
Yeah.
And the carbon discussion that we had, which became the gift with purchase with this. So they were the path of least resistance for us, and that's the one that we forged the relationship. So they get it. Now it's about selling it into their major accounts and being able to get it positioned as part of the contract, because you have and then the second conversation was, well, we know there's an operational savings. Are you willing to share that with the retailer? And they're like, absolutely, that makes perfect sense, right? So let's think through the financial engineering of each of these accounts as to whether it's a little bit off of the rate, or it's part of the overall contract conversation. And then we said, all right, the sustainability component, are you willing to share that as well? And they're like, absolutely, that makes perfect sense. So now it becomes a shared metric that both can report on, right? Now the retailer, we are in second chair in that conversation, right? We go through the carrier account teams to be able to position, but we're the technology solution that we bring in. And the conversation that we have with them is, this is a very easy lift for you. It's 12 pieces of data that you give us, and we give you back 2 pieces of data in order to take action on. Now, we've had to work through some of the mechanics of that because every retailer is a bit of a snowflake, right? But they all have a different system structure. They all have a different security structure. But what we're talking about is, give me your e-commerce order data. I'm going to look to see if I can find a match, and if I can, I'm going to tell you the date to ship it on. Instead of you ship it as fast as possible, I'm scheduling it for you. Like I would schedule same day, next day, right? 3-day, right? And that to me has been that they understand the lift, right? From a technology standpoint. There is a little bit of work on their end that they have to do. And so there has to be some scheduling because everybody is oversubscribed in their technology groups, right?
Yeah.
And then they have to, and then, they use it as a negotiating tactic back with the carrier to say, the sooner I come up with this, can you give me a little bit better rate? So we're trying to create this virtuous 3-way cycle here of everybody is benefiting. We don't charge the retailer anything for this, right? So there's no, it's a free right? Nothing is ever free in this world, but they don't have a third-party cost. And then it becomes a question of how much that the carrier is willing to give them back in terms of, some version of financial incentive to do this. And when it's done right, it just unfolds on its own. Otherwise, you've got to deal with some internal change management issues and some don't move my cheese type of conversations associated with that because of that speed question that we talked about. But I've always felt, and I've always thought this, hard cold dollars will win the day. And if we're giving you something that might turn into pennies of EPS, which it could at scale, and also be something that talks about, taking, hundreds of thousands of metric tons of carbon out of the system, people will listen.
Yeah. Now, last question for you, Mike, because I've enjoyed the points you've made about consumer evolution. I think that's fascinating, partially because I'm part of the study, right? But I'm curious about your thoughts on the next phase of consumer evolution and whether that's taking us from, what did you say? We're at 2.7. We're like not quite 3 full phases of evolution. Whether you want to go from 2.7 to 3 or from 3 to 4, what would be your sense is next from sort of a consumer mindset and maturity evolution?
Yeah, it's a super great question, and we're all in that cohort, right? It's just, are we going to lead the way or are we going to follow? Right. I think it's we are right on the verge of conscious consumerism, right? I mentioned the bamboo hoodie that I'm wearing, right? Understanding where products come from, the impact that they have, et cetera, right? And trying to make better choices. Now back to the Temu and Shein conversation. That's on a different side, right? Yeah. Right, because it kind of breaks all the rules there, right? But I think that at some point there will be a shift where someone says, just having everything cheap and fast isn't the right answer, right? And do I need what I really need is the right set of things to use in my life where I feel at least maybe a little less guilty about the choices that I've made. And I think that, what we're seeing companies brand sustainability, right, into their overall branding. I'll go back to Amazon again. If you paid attention to all of their advertising up until probably spring of this year, it was about how they're trying to build a more sustainable operation, right? It wasn't about selling product, right? Yeah. It wasn't about Prime. It was about, we're trying to build a more sustainable operation. I think people recognize that because that there's an engineering on the financial side that goes along with that, but there's also a investment in the branding component that goes along with that, and people will gravitate to brands that they believe are doing better. I don't think anybody's going to be able to do best, but they're going to be able to do better. And the ones that are doing bad, I think, will be the ones that are punished over time.
Yeah.
And I think those will be the brands, and whether it's the Temus and the Sheins of the world, who knows? I also think that we are, not to get political, but there's a nationalism, globalism conversation going on, right? And I think made in the USA is making a comeback, right? And I know I'm a conscious, I look for those things that are manufactured in the U.S. a little bit more, research the company, try and understand what they stand for, et cetera. So I think those two shits, the conscious consumerism,
Yeah.
it's not just I'm going to look for the best deal, but I'm going to look for what creates the best value in the best situation.
Awesome. And it is fascinating because you mentioned made in the USA. I know for me, that's something where I probably started thinking about it in the perspective of the sort of farm to table, right? Local meat,
Totally.
local produce kind of an idea. And over time it evolves because just like everything else we've talked about today, there are so many motivating factors. Maybe I feel it's better quality. Maybe I recognize that if I buy from this person and spend a little more, that money stays in my community and
Yeah.
helps my neighbor own a business, which for me holds value, right?
Yeah.
And so tying all of these things together to figure out what's going to drive those decisions. And then, of course, how we get those purchases to people's homes. It's going to be interesting to see what this next phase, to your point of maybe conscious consumerism, moves us towards.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought up the local angle. I think that hyper sensitivity to my local community
Yeah, I think
is
so
something
too.
that is absolutely. I mean, I'm seeing it happen. I mean, I live in San Francisco, so it's a company. It's a city reinventing itself, right?
Yep.
And you're starting to see that more and more and more and more. Shop small, shop local, keep the money in the community, et cetera. Get to know the business owners, et cetera. And I think it's a return to that. And I don't think that's a bad thing.
No, I completely agree with you. Now, Mike, I so appreciate your time and your sharing of your expertise and even being willing to share some opinions and make some predictions. That's always when it gets really interesting. If people have listened to this conversation and they want to reach out, if they have questions, if they want to learn more, what is the best way for them to get in touch with you?
Sure. You can always email me at mrobinson, ROBINSON, at T8notch, NOTCH.com. You can go to our website, which is t8notch.com, or you can connect with me on LinkedIn, where I am Mike Robinson for the Eighth Notch. And we're constantly pushing out thought pieces and interviews like this, and you can stay aware. And if you're interested in the product, please let me know. I mean, I would love to tell you a little bit more about it. If we can get you signed up on the program, that'd be fantastic.
Awesome. Well, Mike, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you.